Hey, all you cutie patooties. Just a quick reminder that today is the launch day for Zack's new horror anthology, Hibernator. I mentioned earlier or last month at some point, just to kind of give you a heads up. So Christmas is coming around the corner. Obviously, this would be a perfect gift for that oh so special somebody in your life, or just one of your friends or family members that you know is a bookworm, loves horror, loves to read horror. Hibernator would be a perfect fit for them. I'll leave the link in Park inside the description of this video, as well as pinning it in the comment section so you know where to go. So you can clickety-clack on that thing, grab yourself a copy, and support the man who helps me tremendously in keeping this channel alive and thriving with constant stories. Oh, and this episode is obviously subscriber stories. I went back and found two stories. I only really have two stories of my own. One was from over 2 years ago, and the other one was close to a year ago. So you might have heard these in previous episodes from before, but I figured why not stack a couple of more stories in here just because it wasn't quite as long as I wanted it to be. And I also had to nix a couple of stories for other reasons that I'm not going to go into here. But I will shut up now. And we can get into. So, cheers. My name is Jaden. I'm 18 and I'm from East Alabama, the dirty South. I've grown up as an outdoorsman, letting nature lead my life. I'm a backpacker, a camper, a fisherman, and a hunter. Hunting has always been my favorite as I'm an excellent shot, having been on both my school's archery and shooting teams, as well as on some recreational and out-of-school teams. All the men in my family are hunters. As far back as I can remember, we hit the woods for a couple of months a year in hopes of landing a gorgeous trophy whitetail that could keep the freezer full for at least a year. I am the most competent woodsman in my family, as everybody else is either older or past their prime or even too young to partake in that strenuous adventure. Now that my backstory is out of the way, let's get into the thick of my actual encounter. We own land around the east and middle part of Alabama. One specific piece of land, the question in today, is a few 100-acre plot nestled in Barber County in a swampy population zero town called Banks. It has a history of possibly violent plantation owners, but now it's just nothing. Shack-style homes, sometimes miles apart, being the only buildings around. It's not the type of town you ride through or wonder if Siri got you lost in. We've owned this piece of land since the late 1800s or even early 1900s, but I've only been hunting on it since around 2010. We have multiple purpose-built fields on the edges for easy access, but I am an adrenaline junkie. I like to push the limits and be adventurous, the type of guy not everybody likes to hunt with. For weeks, I'd been planning a short hike into the heart of the swamp, where I knew a bedding area was just tucked away, giving the deer perfect access to their amenities. If I wanted the best shot, this is where I needed to be. It was mid-December in 2020. We headed out for our first yearly trip to this land. I was 15 at the time, and they trusted me to run off alone. I'm a bow hunter, so I didn't have a weapon that could harm me, and they didn't mind if I took off without any adults. Plus, I knew this place, just like they did, so they could find me if I happened to get lost. I had a lot of gear to carry into those woods, so I began packing up around lunchtime. "You sure you want to go alone, bud?" my papa asked me, in an excited but also concerned tone. He always looked out for me, but always made sure I was able to be independent and have some fun of my own. He knew heading off on my own with my own plan was important to me, and he wouldn't stay in the way of that. "For sure. What do you think I am, scared?" I chirped back, unfazed by the trek that I was about to take. As I said, I've been planning for this for weeks and had all kinds of expectations. I was about to prove my manhood. I've taken that route before, so I knew where I was going. I don't think I knew what would happen that night, though. I would have gone even if I had, though. Like I said, an adrenaline dump is my favorite thing in the world. After I packed my lock-on stand, my bow, and my supplies into my bag, I threw it over my shoulder and started out on my trip. The way in was beautiful, minimal sunlight glaring onto that swampy floor through the old, historic oaks. The walk started on a dirt road, a scenic path behind this cow field with some gorgeous checkered dairy cows inside of it. About a quarter of a mile down, I branched off to the right into a small planted pine thicket. I walked down the small game trail, past the trees, and then into the entrance of the swamp. Laid out before me was a desolate dead area of forest that had been fatally flooded by the nearby rivers and streams intersecting throughout it. "All right, let's just get this walk underway now, shall we?" I whispered to myself, as if I was actually talking to somebody. I do this often so I never feel completely alone. It's a bit of a coping mechanism, thinking back on it now. Not the best habit for a hunter though, but hey, a kid's gotta pass the time somehow. As I walked through the swamp, no longer on any trail or even hard ground for that matter, every step that I took sank at least a half a foot into the mud. About a half a mile in, I finally reached the spot that I planned to head towards initially. It was a bit more overgrown than I'd expected though, but I got there early enough to find a new tree. After a few minutes of searching, I found the perfect one, giving me the ability to hide above the low branches and still be able to see a good distance out. I unloaded my pack, began situating my stand onto the tree. A lock-on stand does just that. It locks with straps to the trunk itself. It takes a while to put up, but a lot longer to take down and repack. This is important to know for later on in the story. This wasn't the only way I like to hunt. I like stalking and walking just as much as the next guy, but for this particular area, I knew a tree stand was going to be my best friend. The marsh was good for deer, but bad for boots, so as long as I hung out above them, I'd hopefully be able to get a kill. Packing it out would be a whole different story though. I sat there all night, seeing a plethora of deer and other swamp creatures. I think I even remember seeing a cute little beaver climb up from the creek and began gnawing on a tree. There were wood ducks, mallards, geese, and a ton of deer moving throughout the swamp. But by dark, I still hadn't seen any deer worth dragging through that swamp itself. It was getting extremely windy now. My tree was swaying, and I was about ready to get out. I began my descent, and every step I took down, my anxiety oddly just went up. I was confused in the moment because I love doing things like this, and I never really get that anxious. It was unmistakable though, the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something was hiding among the darkness and loud wisp of wind around me. When I got to the forest floor, I unstrapped my bag and began taking my stand down. Once I had it all down, I strapped up. Then that feeling of panic just hit me hard, and I have no clue why. I continued looking around me as I strapped up that last climbing stick. I threw the pack over my shoulder and just began walking out of the woods. I always use a light at night, not to see the way because I could see at this point, as my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, but to ward off any offenders, mainly hogs. They were known to be aggressive in the dark, especially those big nasty razorback hogs. The tusks on some of them could rip up an unsuspecting hunter to pieces, and this far out of police jurisdiction, inside the swamp, you might never be found. Tonight was different though. I kept my light off. I was horrified that something, I didn't know what, would see me. I focused on the moonlit horizon and found a specific treetop on my path to track forward. This path was nothing more than the ground with a mental map to follow. It ran parallel to the biggest of the 3 creeks inside these woods. The water was, I'd say, around 3 to 4 feet deep inside the center and about 12 feet wide most of the way down. As I walked closer to the creek, that feeling of dread completely swept over me. And that's when I heard a small splash in the water nearby. I froze, horrified by whatever could have made that. Honestly, it could have been anything, but I was already on edge. The weirdest thing was that when that splash was made, it was as if a light switch had been flipped. The forest just turned itself off. All the wind, all the noise, all the small leafy steps of squirrels finding their trees, it all just stopped. This is where I started to freak out. The woods never get quiet, especially at night. That's when most of the noise would come out, between owls, bugs, deer, everything else. It should not have been this quiet, and I knew that, especially with the wind that had just been coursing through the trees. Just as I began to put my foot down to make a little bit more progress, I heard another splash. This time it was heavier and closer to the middle of the creek. I could tell because of the deep sound of the splash. A shallow splash makes a higher pitched sound. At this point, I just completely stopped, flicked on my phone light, and threw it in the creek's direction. What I saw made my skin prickle. About eye level with me was a pair of red eyes. I wasn't near a road, and the closest one was going parallel to me, meaning any taillights wouldn't have been pointed directly at me. I was gone. I put my light up and bolted in the direction that I knew to go. I called my buddy and told him to have the four-wheeler pointed towards the road once I got to the intersection. No questions. Then I hung up. Behind me, I heard feet slamming into the leaves, but I was running so fast that I couldn't even hear anymore after that. I ran so fast I could have beaten Tyreek Hill's 40-yard dash time, not looking back even if I had to. When I made it to the intersection at the same time, my buddy was pulling up, meaning I cleared that whole mile or so within 10 minutes with all that weight on my back. As I saw him pull up, relief washed over me, but it was only mixed with that feeling of dread that still had not yet gone away. Once I turned the corner, standing at that intersection, I felt that something was still in my presence, extremely close. At that same moment, my buddy had now turned in, lighting up the path in front of me. Within arm's reach of me, 3 deer stood in the trail, looking directly at me. I jumped back, landing on my ass and almost choking on my own throat. I'd been looking for these big bastards all night, and here they were, way out by the road. They looked spooked, like something had ran them out this far. Hell, maybe it could have been me for all I knew. My buddy, seeing what all had happened, almost pissed himself laughing, helping me up and then onto the four-wheeler, trying to help me laugh it off as well, but it wasn't happening. I could not shake what had just happened to me. Of course, I could chalk it up to just the deer I saw, curious about what I was doing, but I know what I saw and I know what I heard. Something was in that creek, standing at least at my height out of the water, plus whatever was underwater as well. And the fact that it only took one step to go from the center of that creek onto the bank, which was at least a 5-foot distance. I don't know about you, but I don't know of any deer or creature at all that could stand at least 7 feet tall minimum, have red eyes, and be able to take a single step like that from a full stop, especially out of the water. That's my story. Maybe it's boring, maybe you don't believe me, but the hunting community will get a rise out of it. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I've never forgotten it and I probably never will. I still go back pretty often. Like I said, I chase adrenaline. Maybe that will kill me one day, or maybe it won't. I never saw anything back there again either, but I have begun to tell people about what I saw, and much to my surprise, my cousin had a similar encounter. He was in that same swamp, sitting on the opposite side in a ladder stand. Sometime throughout the night, he'd fallen asleep. Once it was dark, he woke up to the sound of a gruesome holler, something you would hear from an Aztec death whistle, except nobody was in those woods, and those toys weren't popular when this happened. It was in the early 2000s. He shot up from that scream and looked around, and similar to me, everything got dead quiet. He saw them too, red eyes watching and glowing at him. When he made eye contact, he said whatever it was turned and took off. He got out of there, and unlike me, he never returned.
This took place in 2016. I work for the USPS delivering mail in the Midwest. I've been at this job for around 5 years, and I can honestly say I've met and encountered some very unique individuals, to say the least. I will give you a quick description of myself because I feel it's relevant to the story and how I don't look exactly like your typical mailman. I'm a male around 6 foot, 195 pounds, covered in tattoos with long blonde hair and gauges. Although many people have told me I don't look approachable, I am friendly. I'm kind to everyone I encounter, especially while working. Now back to the actual event itself. I'd recently started a new route, and since I was so low on the totem pole, seniority-wise, this route wasn't exactly in the nicest neighborhoods. Towards the end of the day, I would finish my route down this long stretch of road with a lot of decrepit houses that were either vacant or even barely livable, at least in my opinion. With only a few deliveries remaining, my last package for the day was for a Mr. Smith and what looked like to be medication from the VA hospital. Myself, being a fellow vet, thought, well, at least I know me and him will get along nicely. Mr. Smith's trailer was located down a small, narrow dirt path that also had 3 or 4 other trailers around it. As I said earlier, this was my first day on this route, so finding the actual trailer belonging to him was going to take a moment or two, seeing that they weren't labeled with any actual numbers. Most of the other trailers that were around it had garbage and random objects lying around, as well as windows being smashed and graffiti on them, so I assumed those weren't the ones that were occupied. There was only one that stuck out and looked halfway livable, so I guessed and assumed this was the one. I jumped out of my truck and headed up the stairs, and then gently knocked on the door. I hear footsteps approach the door right before it's yanked open, revealing a very large man, 6'6" or 6'7", easily pushing 300 plus pounds. He bellowed out this booming, "Yeah?" I quickly stammered out, "Hey sir, I have a package that needs a signature for Mr. Smith." He replies with, "Oh yeah, that's my father, but I can sign for it for him." No problem. It's a frequent thing for family to sign for other family, so I handed him the slip of paper. He fumbled with it, trying to find a surface to write on, and it was then I immediately smelled all the booze, quickly realizing that this dude was hammered. It took him way longer than it should have to scribble a name down onto that slip. He finally hands it back to me, and I handed him the small parcel. Immediately, I gave him a, "All right, have a good evening, man," as I was about to leap off the porch, head back to the office and call it a day, and have a few drinks myself. It's been a long week. Just as I was getting off the porch, he yelled out at me, "Hey, is that a Michael the Archangel and Lucifer tattooed on your arm?" I turned around and replied, "Yeah, it is," politely chuckling. He then told me he's got a painting in the garage of them. It looks exactly like that tattoo. I'm thinking to myself in the moment, "All right, cool, man, that's random as hell." But out loud, I spoke, "Wow, that's crazy, man, cool." I turned around, walking back to my truck again. But as I did so, he yelled out to me once more, "You want to see it?" Internally to myself, I thought, "Not really, I really don't care." But I mumbled out to him, "Sorry, man, I need to get back to the office, unfortunately." But before I actually got back into the truck to leave, he darted over to the garage and then insisted I come in. It will only take a second. Without actually saying it, he held out his arm and gave that "after you" motion, now to an open garage door. Before I even realized what I was doing, I found myself stepping inside, cursing myself for being a people pleaser and having a hard time saying no or being rude to people. Although it was 5 p.m. in the middle of summer and the sun still out shining brightly, the garage itself was pitch black. I noticed that 2 small windows were covered with newspaper. An initial weird, sketchy situation was now getting even sketchier. He closed the door, and I was immediately plunged into complete darkness. I then muttered aloud, "It's kind of dark in here." He followed back chuckling, "Yeah, give me a sec, I'll get the light." A few moments pass. I hear a soft click as he pulls the string on this tiny light bulb, which barely illuminated anything. It was enough to notice, though, that the floor was completely covered in empty liquor and beer bottles. Trash and, of course, rusty tools were all strewn about. He moves past me and walked to what appeared to be the back room of the garage, and then just stood at the threshold. "It's back here. Come take a look," with this sheepish grin on his face. Now alarms were shrieking. Red flags were shooting up even higher than before. I've listened to enough Let's Not Meet and Let's Read stories over the years to know better than to walk back there. I've been in quite a few sketchy situations over the years, with the tour in Afghanistan and plenty of other instances. I'm no Billy Badass by any means, but I'm comfortable and confident enough to know I can hold my own when I need to. I was terrified. Something about this man was just off. His mannerisms, his presence itself just creeped me out. And now I need an excuse to get the hell out of here. So I finally took hold of the wheel and put my politeness and kindness in the back seat. I knew if I pressed the enter button on my scanner that was located on my hip, it would beep loudly, seeing as if I hadn't actually scanned a barcode. I took my right hand and pressed the button. The loud beep emitted through the air, and I put on the best acting scene of my life, pretending I gotten a message from my boss saying he needed me back at the office ASAP. "Shit," I said loudly. "My boss needs me back for something. Sorry, man. Another time for sure." As I backpedaled out and lightly jogged back to my truck, as I stole a final glance at him before leaving, that grin was gone, now replaced with this stern, pissed-off grimace. When I returned back to the office, I relayed that story to my supervisor. He agreed it was weird and creepy, but couldn't even comprehend why I even entered that garage. He also told me if I was uncomfortable making future deliveries, I could notice the packages, and Mr. Smith would have to come to the post office itself to pick up them. I felt bad that I would be forcing an older fellow vet to go out of his way regularly, but I wasn't wanting to encounter his son again if I didn't have to. So from there on out, that's exactly what I did. Maybe he did have that painting back there. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I really don't give a shit. So to that drunken Ed Kemper lookalike, I don't want to meet again.
Around 9 years ago, my mother, sister, cousin, grandmother, and I went to visit our great-grandfather inside this small town called Floyan. It's a beautiful, kind of ancient little town in France, with a population that I'd say about maybe 200 to 300 people. It was surrounded by grassland and farmland with plenty of hillsides that allowed the morning sun and sunsets to slowly trickle into view. Every year from when I was a boy, we'd make the long journey from my home in England to this beautiful little town that we'd call home for 10 days. I'd love to tell you that this journey and time away, and this time around, was perfect and absolutely the break that we all needed, but it wasn't. Before I start this horrible experience, I'll give you some backstory as to how it all went down. It all started with a journey to France. We would travel to the coast from the middle of the country, Dover Harbor to be specific, to get to the ferry across to Calais in France. I still remember that crisp ocean air smacking me across the face, which left a surprisingly satisfying feeling. It made me feel cultured, well-traveled, like a lone wolf across borders. I guess that was something of the case, truth be told. We arrived in Calais, all very excited to travel a few hours through that gorgeous country of France. We watched as we went from urban to suburban to rural. I watched as those familiar farmlands and hillsides appeared before me. It was always a treat to watch the cityscape dissolve into nothing but rolling green hills. It was midday at the time, so there was plenty of time to explore and catch up with our great-grandfather, and then set up a tent with my little cousin, sister, and I that we were all excited to sleep in throughout that journey. Little did I know that would be the last time I would ever sleep in a tent ever again. My great-grandfather's house was this old building. The door was peeling white paint that had been applied years before. He was 90 at the time, so I couldn't blame him for not doing work on the house. Of course, but it left this eerie vibe. The house also had a huge cellar, which I was always too scared to go down to alone because of some noises that I'd heard prior. But now at the age of 22, I realized it was probably just mice or rats. It wouldn't surprise me, as this house was literally in the middle of the countryside. Outside of the house, he had a garden. Half of the garden you couldn't see because of the garage. To actually see the rest, you had to walk around the building. We set up the tent in the garden behind the garage, so we didn't have to walk all the way around the wall just to get inside. There was a straight shot through a doorway from where we were positioned. Let me quickly describe the other part of the garden that you couldn't see from the tent. It's important to the story. There was a large shed made out of concrete, so it really was just a storage full of junk. There was also a small patch of grass for us kids to play in, which was fenced off. It wasn't a large fence, but big enough for even 13-year-old me to jump over. This was all out of the way on the far side of the building. France at that time was pretty hot, so we would leave the house a lot and come back late. Sometimes we'd go on walks around the country lanes, just enjoying the scenery and watching the sun dip below the hills, leaving this fluorescent orange and pink glow. The sight was enough to make 13-year-old me freeze in awe. I would stand there and just stare as the sun dipped and the moon rose. We would do this almost every day, visiting the cows on the farmer's land, picking blackberries from the outstretched stems. It was ideal, the time that I needed to clear my tainted mind from all the negativity at home. I was being bullied at the time, and being there just helped me forget about it all. One night though, a storm was supposed to hit. My family and I heard rolling thunder in the distance, and almost was a warning of the terrors to come that night. We watched from the tent as streaks of orange lightning lit up the sky, miles down the hillside from us. It was like our own personal firework display. I was in awe of the sight again, as was my great-grandfather, who even got out of his chair to watch, and he would never get out of his chair for anybody. But as it got later, it was time to sleep. My family and I climbed back into the tent, while my mother helped my grandmother put my grandfather to bed. About 5 minutes later, she joined us in the tent and got into her sleeping bag. I lie awake, listening to the raindrops hit the roof, when I could have sworn that I heard a twig snap off in the distance. It was a distinct sound, and I've been listening to the raindrops for so long that any different sound would really catch my attention. I figured it had to be one of the cows, so I just brushed it aside and quickly fell asleep. I'd say an hour later, I was woken up by my mother, whispering for me to run inside right now. Confused, I thought maybe the tent was gonna flood, or maybe the lightning was getting too close. My mom dragged my sister, cousin, and I outside of that tent and into the old dining room, where we ended up sleeping for the night. My sister was in hysterics, and my cousin and I were completely confused. I was also stunned to see my great-grandfather storming into the garden with a handgun, screaming in French at the top of his lungs. I later learned he was yelling, "Get the fuck off my property before I shoot." He was an old war vet, and shooting had always been one of his favorite pastimes. He was also a no-nonsense type of man, especially when it came to danger. He would face it head on. All night, every noise I heard made me think something was trying to get inside. Scratches at the shutter, knocking on the front door, loud pounding at the garage door. All of it had me shaken to the core, but I still don't know what was lurking outside. That night passed and we woke up the next morning, still very confused about what had happened. My mother told me there'd been a cat in the garden. It was genuinely the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard, so I never really believed it. Why would my 90-year-old great-grandfather come out of bed in nothing but his underwear and a vest in the pouring rain over a cat? I was young, but I wasn't naive. During the day, I thought I'd explore and see what I could find, do my own investigation, so to speak. I searched the attic, which was connected to the washroom by the stairs, and found nothing. I checked the garage. I checked the front of a house. Nothing. Then I searched that hidden part of the garden. What I found terrified me. In the section of the garden behind the concrete building, there was a pair of large boot prints. Nestled in the brush nearby was a single bullet lying in the ground. I ran inside and just did some coloring and never even spoke about it to my mother. To this day, I don't know what the person's intentions were, but they clearly weren't good. Why would you carry a gun in the middle of nowhere to an old man's house? I think maybe the tent spooked them. They rushed away and dropped a bullet. I don't know, I don't have any proof of this, but I know one thing. I'm never going to camp out there again. This was one of the first few messed up things to ever happen to me in Floyon. Maybe one day, if it goes over well, I'll share a few of my other stories. I'm a woman, and this story happened to me in January of 2012, when it was not the warmest weather in Isla Vista, California. It was our first day back from Christmas break, and the next college semester had started that day. It was around 7:30 in the morning when I walked into Starbucks with one of my girlfriends, who I'll call Ella. Me and her would go to Starbucks damn near every day, and we would always order our caramel vanilla swirl iced coffee. When we went inside, we saw the line was getting pretty long, but it was actually moving quickly. In front of us, we saw this short-haired, pretty pale-skinned and skinny man. He turned around for I'd say maybe 3 seconds because he heard us talking about each other, and then smiled at us. I have to admit that smile was pretty creepy. It definitely gave off stalker smile vibes. Neither of us smiled back at him, and he turned back around. It was then his turn to order, and he ordered 2 hot skinny vanilla lattes. I found this awkward because he wasn't with anybody else. Why did he order 2 of them? Well, unfortunately, I found out the hard way. He then walked away from the counter as he finished his order. Me and Ella then ordered and finished ours as well. I'd say maybe 3 to 4 minutes later, I heard one of the Starbucks employees call out to the man in front of us by the name of Elliot. We then saw Elliot grab his 2 hot lattes, and he took off both of the lids. Didn't really know what he was doing, and then all of a sudden, we saw his hands jerk forward and saw the hot liquids of the latte being thrown into the air. Me and Ella could not react quick enough. The liquid ended up landing on our faces, and it was boiling hot. We yelped in pain, and it all happened so quickly. We then heard this man Elliot say, "That's what you 2 bitches get for not smiling back." He ran out of the store and disappeared. We were still trying to process what had just happened. An employee came up and asked if we were okay, and I asked him to get us a cold cloth because our faces were burning. He said no problem and quickly came back with the cloth, and we put it on our faces. It felt very soothing as my face was cooling down. The manager then walked out to talk to us. He asked us if we needed to get the police involved. We told him that we were okay and that it wasn't that big of a deal. Me and Ella didn't end up going to classes that day as we were still recovering from what had taken place. That man Elliot was probably just super insecure of himself and thought we were attractive or something. Didn't really know what else to do in that situation. Maybe he has never really been in a relationship with a girl before. Maybe he hasn't even talked to that many girls. He had to have been some sort of incel. Eventually 2 years passed by, and that incident faded away from my memory, but was brought back up in May of 2014. During this year, I just finished my junior year of college and was living in my apartment that I'd gotten back in August of 2013. I woke up one morning and turned on the news as I would do every day. While I was watching, I saw something that made my body turn numb. I saw that 7 people had been killed by gunfire, and the perpetrator was none other than that man Elliot, who'd splashed me and my friend inside that Starbucks with those hot lattes back in January of 2012. His full name was revealed as Elliot Roger. I could not believe what I was seeing. Immediately, I called Ella and told her to turn on the news. She was in total shock as well. She kept freezing her words because she didn't even know what to say. Everything came back to us. The time when he splashed those lattes on our faces just because we didn't smile back at him. Some stories stick with you, no matter how much time passes, and this is one of those memories. A shadow in the corner of my mind, hazy but incessant, like smoke that refuses to clear. It isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's probably not the scariest thing you've ever heard, but it's still left a mark on me. It was sometime in the early 2010s. I was maybe 12 or 13 at most, and more interested in exploring the virtual landscapes of Skyrim than anything happening in the real world. We lived in a modest, slightly rundown house on a street that always smelled faintly of exhaust and sun-baked concrete. The house had a white garage door that faced the street, with a narrow driveway sloping down towards the curb. On one side of the yard, there was a low black metal gate that felt more like decorative than actually functional, and a border of scraggly cactus plants that my mom liked to call our budget security system. Life was far from perfect, but it was ours. My mom worked hard to keep things running smoothly, and my stepdad, well, let's just say he wasn't winning any Parent of the Year awards. He wasn't that bad, at least not compared to his son Kyle, who was my stepbrother. I called him Step Douche, a nickname that stuck after years of his hot-headed antics and shady behavior. He wasn't outright cruel, at least not to my mom or me, but there was this undercurrent of unpredictability about him, like he could go from zero to enraged in a blink of an eye. Step Douche had his own demons. Like we all pretended that he wasn't a meth addict, even when the signs were glaringly obvious. It was our dysfunctional little family, but we made it work more or less. The day my story takes place, it was hot out. The kind of oppressive heat that clings to your skin. It makes every task feel 10 times harder. I remember the sky being flat, this washed out blue, like somebody had drained all the life out of it. I'd been dragged away from my game to help Step Douche wash our car. He was barking out orders, his voice echoing off the garage door. All the while, I scrubbed at the tires with his old sponge that smelled faintly of mildew. My mom had just stepped outside to bring us some water, and that's when we heard this car pull up. It was an older sedan, the kind of car that had probably seen better days a decade ago. The paint was faded, the windows were smudged, and the engine rattled as it idled on the curb. Inside sat a man that I can only really describe as skeletal. His face was all sharp at these angles. His skin was stretched taut over these prominent cheekbones, and his eyes seemed hollow, dark pits that seemed to drink everything he saw. He had short, greasy brown hair that stuck to his forehead, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He leaned outside the open window, lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Excuse me, miss," he called out. His voice was hoarse. "Can you help me with some directions?" My mom, ever the polite one, stepped a little closer to the curb. I stayed back watching, though I wasn't really paying too much attention. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by and ask for directions in our neighborhood. This was well before smartphones were a given, and not everybody had GPS. But there was something off about this guy, the way he looked at her, like he wasn't just looking, he was dissecting her with his eyes. Yeah, sure, where are you trying to go?" she asked. The man just gestured vaguely, muttering something that I couldn't quite hear. My mom tilted her head, frowning slightly, then took a step closer to the car to get a better look at him or maybe to hear him better. Her expression changed in an instant, shifting from mild confusion to absolute horror. She let out this sharp gasp, stumbling back as though she'd been physically struck. The man did not say a word, didn't even blink, he just stared at her, his grin widening, and then, suddenly, a screech of tires and he was gone. The car sped off down the street, the sound of its engine fading off into the distance. For a moment, everything was still. My mom was just frozen in the driveway, hands trembling and her face pale. Step-douche, who'd been fiddling with the garden hose, looked up immediately. He dropped the hose and stormed over to her, literally growling. "The hell happened?" he demanded. She shook her head on the verge of tears. I don't know, he was... She couldn't quite seem to get the words out. She glanced over at me, her eyes wide, and then looked back towards the street, as if expecting the car to reappear somehow. Step-douche's face darkened. "Did you get the plate?" he asked. She shook her head again, and he cursed under his breath. "Useless," he muttered. Though whether he meant it for her or himself, I wasn't sure. He grabbed his phone and stomped inside, slamming the door behind him. Inside, I could hear him speaking to his dad, who also seemed to get fired up. My mom just stood there for a moment longer, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Finally, she turned to me and forced this shaky smile. "It's okay," she said, though I could tell it wasn't. "Just go back to your game, sweetheart." I didn't argue with her. I ran inside and put my headset back on and lost myself in the world of dragons and magic. But the image of that man's skeletal face lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't until a few years later, long after we moved out of that house and Step-douche and Dad were out of our lives, that I finally asked my mom about it. We were sitting in her kitchen, sipping coffee and reminiscing about the old days, when for some reason that memory resurfaced. "What happened with that guy in the car?" I asked. "The one who asked for directions?" Her face went still, and for a moment I thought she might brush it off, but then she sighed and set her coffee cup down, her hands clasped tightly together. He was doing something disgusting," she said. "He was touching himself right there in the driver's seat, all the while he stared at me." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What?" She nodded, her eyes distant. I didn't know what to do. I just froze, and then he drove off before I could do really anything else. "That's disgusting." "That wasn't all," she went on. "He also had a pair of scissors, and he was mutilating himself too. There wasn't hardly anything left. Blood was all over his lap, and he was still trying to masturbate with what was left there. Absolutely was the worst thing I'd ever seen." I stared back at her, my mind racing. The memory of that day came flooding back. The way she gasped, the look of terror on her face, the screech of those tires as the man sped away. I realized then just how lucky we'd been. He definitely could have done so much worse. Was he crazy, on drugs? Was this some sort of fetish? Did he actually need directions to the hospital? This situation created a whole new terror of its own. He could have easily hopped out with those bloody pair of scissors and attacked me or my mom, or both. The idea of interacting with such a person inside a state like that is nauseating to this day. I still think about that man, and I wonder where he went and what the hell he was thinking, and what might have happened if my mom had been there alone that day. For some odd reason, I don't really remember much about my childhood. This story, this moment, I can recall like it just happened yesterday. I couldn't have been any older than 5 at the time. My mom had remarried, and she, myself, and my stepdad had found a home inside this very small town. The house itself, I remember being older and by no means perfect, but perfect for a family of 3 and had a lot of potential. To paint you a mental picture, when you walked up the flight of stairs to get to the 2nd floor, a T-shaped hallway would lead to each of the 3 bedrooms. Immediately to your right was the master bedroom, and down a short hallway to your left would be the other two adjacent bedrooms. I remember my bedroom being in the bigger of the three, the one immediately to your right. I can still vividly picture my giant red bunk bed taking up most of the room. My bunk bed had springs, not an actual box spring like most beds today. So when you would lay down on it or even get up off of it, the springs would groan loudly from the weight itself. Every single night, my mother would lay with me to comfort me and help ease me to sleep. I know it's fairly normal for a child to not be able to sleep in their own room sometimes, and especially when it's in a completely new house and environment. There was something off about that house though, and I could sense it then, and I can still sense it now. Something that I really can't quite explain, but this story is my attempt to. I would always feel eyes on me, this heavy, uneasy feeling, especially at night and especially when I was alone. My mom has told me multiple times that during the nightly routine of laying me down and laying with me at night, she would believe that I was finally asleep. So she would slowly make an attempt to get out of my bed and retreat back to hers, only to have those springs creak loudly and give herself away. I would wake up immediately, calling out for her, "Mom, Mom." Then she would have to come back, lay down with me, and hopefully get me to sleep again. Now, there would be occasions where I was sleeping hard enough for her to actually make the move silently back to her own bedroom. I would wake up sometimes late into the night, only to realize that I was now completely alone in my own bed. I'd shoot up, grab my blanket, and sprint down that short hallway to get to their bedroom on the left. I'd silently climb up into their bed and place myself between my mom and stepdad. That way I'd have a barrier on both sides of me, and it just felt safer. Once I got comfortable enough, I'd fall asleep not long after. And this is where shit gets kind of weird. Not only did I not understand these events as a child, I still to this day have no real answer to what this was or even why. Now, it wasn't every single night that this would happen, usually a few times a week. I would wake up in a panic, lying on my right side, facing the bedroom door. The first thing that I would always take note of was that the bedroom door was halfway ajar, and a small portion of the hallway light would be spilling into the room. Although at first I don't really even know why this was, I would be drenched in fear from the moment that I woke up, and then it would progressively get worse as I would take in my surroundings. The next thing that I noticed was that I was not able to move at all. I was completely paralyzed. The only thing I could move was my eyes. The next thing that I took note of was that I was now completely alone in my parents' bed. My stepdad was no longer in front of me, and my mom was no longer behind me. I knew this because the entire bed in front of me was completely empty, and I could feel the edge of the bed itself on my backside. This obviously would crank up my fear more and more as I took it all in. This next thing is definitely the worst part and the creepiest part, and is what's still really unexplainable to this day. I would feel the back of my pajama shirt lift up, and someone would start to caress my back, sort of like a mother would do to comfort their child. Only this was the same feeling that I described earlier, where it just felt off, weird. Somehow I knew this was not my mother, and I knew it was not my stepfather. In these moments, I would be completely consumed with fear and terror. I was paralyzed, so I couldn't turn around and see who it actually was. Although thinking back now, I doubt I would have even had the courage to turn around and look, even if I could, to face whatever it was behind me. As the tears would silently fall down my cheeks, I would cry myself to sleep, hoping this would all just go away. I'd wake up the next morning still rattled from the events from the night prior. Only now I was able to move freely. I'd jump out of bed and run to find my mom. They would both normally be up and about, doing their normal morning routines. Most of the time, I remember finding myself too scared to even talk about it or ask my mom about it. There was occasions when I would try, casually bring it up to her, and she would do what parents normally do in these situations, shrug it off as a bad dream or some kind of overactive imagination. There is absolutely no way this was a dream. I'm 100% certain about that. I don't really remember much about my childhood, but this memory is cemented in my head. I can't recall all these happy memories or milestone events within our family that I was told about, but I can recount every single terrifying moment of those nights as a child. Whatever this was would torment me a few times a week, for a few years, and then it just stopped. I'm 34 years old now, and I still have no idea who or what that was. I'm telling you my story because I've kept it to myself for all of these years, but not too long ago, I overheard my younger brother talking about some weird experiences that he's had growing up in that same exact house. I then realized that his bedroom is in fact the same bedroom that I had had all my experiences in as well. One day while driving him home from school, I opened up to him, told him everything that happened to me all those years ago. He then proceeded to tell me everything that happened to him inside those last 16 years since he's been living there. These next events and stories are his and what he experienced himself inside our childhood home. As a beforehand, I'd like to tell you that my stories are a bit lengthy, but stick with me. The first major encounter with an unwanted presence happened shortly after my 7th birthday. What I remember was going to my room and settling in bed for the night. After a long while of staring up at the ceiling and avoiding bedtime as much as I could, I finally got tired. I turned off my lamp that sat next to my bed before lying back in bed. The room was now dark and actually felt quite peaceful. I was extremely close to drifting off before I started hearing this noise. It was almost like a crackling sound. I opened up my eyes and sat up, confused on what it was. As I continued to listen, I realized that the sound was more like scratching than crackling, and it was coming from the wall above me. A skinny handprint was scratching itself onto the wall, like the way some animals get branded. This hand was branding itself onto the wall. Now, it was very faint, but still extremely noticeable. The next thing I did was scream so loud that my parents ran in, wondering what the hell was going on. The scratching had then stopped. I told them what I heard and what I saw, but never mentioned anything about where the hand was located. My dad said that it was just mice running through the walls before sending me back to sleep and going back to their bedroom. He never once asked me where the handprint was or even tried to investigate it. Why, I don't know. For a long while after that, I slept in my parents' room until I got old enough and brave enough to sleep back in my own room and felt comfortable enough to be back in my own room. However, the nightlight next to my bedstand always stayed on from then on out. The handprint that I mentioned was visible for the next few months. I remember even showing it to my closest friend. It's now faded and completely gone since we repainted the room, but I still have no idea what the hand was or who it belonged to. I know for sure that it wasn't mice though. The next encounter happened when I was 9. The memory of that handprint had stuck with me, however, but I was slowly beginning to doubt what had happened and started feeding into the idea that maybe it actually was just mice. However, all those doubts came crashing down one night. It was a pretty ordinary night. I turned off my light and left the room in the shadowy dark. I laid down and within minutes I was asleep. A few hours later, I remember waking up and staring up at my dark ceiling fan. I was lying flat, which gave me a good view of my room through my periphery. My eyes darted to one of the corners of my room, where my bookshelf and dresser was. There, I could just slightly see this extremely skinny figure hunkering nearby my dresser. My heart rate began to pick up. I was thinking that whatever had left that handprint in the walls 2 years prior had now come back to pay me another visit. I tried to squirm out of my bed, but I couldn't move. I tried again, but nothing. I wanted to lunge towards my doorway if I could just somehow free myself from these invisible restraints. I looked back towards the figure and noticed something that made my stomach sink even further. One of this thing's long, pale legs was now one step closer to my bed. I couldn't tell you what I was wearing, but back then I could list every detail. It was still hiding in the shadows, not revealing any gender or any facial features, if it even had any. I shut my eyes and tried to fall back asleep. I heard a few creaks in the floorboard, letting me know that whatever it was now coming closer. I kept my eyes shut tightly, trying my best to relax and fall back asleep. The last thing I remember was feeling a cold and rough hand stroking my head once, very slightly. I kept my eyes shut tightly and just prayed that I'd fall back asleep. The next morning I awoke to nothing in that corner, and I could finally move my body. I wasted absolutely no time getting out of the room. It could have possibly been sleep paralysis, and if that's what it was, then I hope to never experience it again. It was a one-time occurrence, and I hope it stays that way. I resumed using that nightlight for obvious reasons. My last and final occurrence happened on a Saturday morning. It was just me and my dad home, since my mom worked most of those mornings. I was upstairs drawing something and rewatching the first Harry Potter movie on my mom's laptop. I heard my dad opening up the attic in the hallway. It has a distinct sound, almost like springs. I heard the door open, but didn't hear any footsteps walking up the ladder. Being the curious kid I was, I walked outside of my room and into the hallway. Sidebar, but I always loved when my dad went into the attic because if you asked him nicely, he might bring some old toys or other interesting items. So I was gonna ask him to. When I looked up the ladder to see, it was completely pitch black, which is highly unusual. If and when my dad went up into the attic, he'd always turn on the bright studio light that was up there. He couldn't be up there though because it was completely pitch black. Weird. So I called up to him. "Dad?" I got no response. This was definitely not normal, so I didn't really question it anymore. Instead, I quickly hurried down the stairs. I checked all of our rooms downstairs, determining that he definitely wasn't inside. So I went out to the garage to check, hoping he'd be out there. He was in the garage, and I asked him if he'd recently been inside the attic or was planning on going up there because I heard the hatch door opening. He told me no, claiming that he'd been outside in the garage for the past hour. I didn't ask any more questions. I just slowly walked back inside, keeping that eerie experience to myself. I was so nervous that I didn't even go back upstairs until night. But I did walk by, momentarily glancing up the stairs after coming back in, and when I looked up there, the hatch to the attic had now been closed and sealed, guaranteeing that nobody was up there. I don't know if it was real or not, or if it was some kind of trick that my mind was playing on me. The last thing that I'll mention is something that my friend said to me not long after one of these instances. We were just chilling and sitting in my room watching TV when he randomly told me and asked me not to go to sleep early. When I asked him why, he responded, "I just don't like this house when I'm awake and everybody else is asleep." When I asked him what he meant by that, and it's something that's still stuck with me to this day, "This house is more awake when everybody else is asleep." I agreed with him, not showing how much that sentence actually terrified me, and just laughed it off. That night, I waited for him to fall asleep first, and then I did. I think he's right though. The house's sunrise was our sundown. Hey everybody, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button. Please hit the notification bell. And please subscribe. You can stalk me on X. You can stalk me on Instagram. And you can also buy official Booze and Booze merchandise at my website, www.boozeandbooze.net. You can buy merch. You can submit your own true scary story there. And you can find anything and everything you need on that site. Another reminder to please, if you can, go and pick up a copy of Zack's new anthology that I talked about at the top of the episode. I know he would appreciate it, as well as I. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and I wish I had more of my own stories to share, but those are really my only two. One while I was working at the ye old post office, and then one from my childhood as well. So feel free to, again, send me your own true scary stories. I need to do more subscriber episodes more often, but just get kind of caught up, and it takes Zack, I'm sure, a while to sift through of them because there's quite a few of them. But yeah, I want your stories, so please, there is an email, I think it's drivethroughmedia@gmail or something like that. But the easiest way is just to literally go to my website, www.boozeandbooze.net, and submit your scary story there. It immediately will get submitted and then sent over to Zack directly, so where he can sift through it, do his due diligence and do his thing. So if you got a scary story of your own that you'd like to potentially hear on my channel, please go and do that. Pick up some merch as well. And I think that'll be it. I can't remember exactly what scary or what themes are for next week. I always forget, but they'll be out next week. Tuesday and Thursday upload schedule per usual. Right? Fingers crossed. Should be good to go. Okay, I'm rambling at this point. I love you all. I hope you have a fantastic day and a fantastic weekend, or whenever the hell you're listening to this. Hope you have a good day. I love you all. Cheers.